I used to work for a relatively small security company. It was a quiet job, mostly just sitting in empty buildings, making sure everything was safe. My name is Tom, and I've been doing this job for a few years now, but there's one night I'll never forget. It was a chilly October evening when I got assigned to watch over an old abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. The place gave me the creeps from the moment I arrived. The windows were broken, and the wind howled through the empty halls, but I needed the paycheck, so I sucked it up and got to work. As the sun set and darkness settled over the building, I felt a sense of unease wash over me. I tried to shake it off, reminding myself that it was just an old building, nothing to be afraid of. But deep down, I knew there was something off about that place. I did my rounds, checking every corner of the hospital, making sure no one had snuck in. Everything seemed normal until I reached the basement. The air down there was thick and musty, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I descended the stairs. The basement was dark, barely illuminated by the dim glow of my flashlight. I shone it around, trying to make out my surroundings, when I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere in the darkness. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but then I heard it again, closer this time. I knew I had to get out of there, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. I started to back away slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand. That's when I saw it, a pair of glowing eyes staring at me from the shadows. I let out a scream and turned to run, but something grabbed hold of my ankle, sending me crashing to the ground. I scrambled to get away, kicking and thrashing against whatever had me trapped, but it was no use. Whatever it was too strong, dragging me further into the darkness. I fought against it with everything I had, but it was like trying to wrestle with a shadow. Just when I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, I felt it release its grip and I scrambled to my feet, sprinting up the stairs and out of the basement. I didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for air and covered in sweat. I looked back at the hospital, half expecting to see whatever had attacked me chasing after me. But there was nothing, just the dark silhouette of the building against the night sky. I stumbled back to my car, shaking from head to toe. I didn't know what I had encountered down there, but I knew one thing for sure. I never wanted to go back. I quit my job the next day, telling my boss I needed a break from security work. But deep down, I knew the real reason. I was terrified of what lurked in the shadows of that old hospital. To this day, I still have nightmares about that night. And every time I close my eyes, I can still hear that low, guttural growl echoing in the darkness, a reminder of the horrors that lurk just out of sight. A couple of years ago, I was home alone, enjoying a rare night of peace. My parents had gone out for a dinner date, and my siblings were away at college. I was looking forward to a night of binge watching my favorite TV show and indulging in some guilty pleasure snacks. As I settled into the couch, I noticed that the house was eerily quiet. The creaks and groans of the old wooden floorboards seemed louder than usual, and the wind outside seemed to be whispering strange melodies. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as the night wore on, the strange noises grew louder and more frequent. I heard footsteps outside my room and the sound of someone rummaging through the kitchen. I tried to tell myself it was just the house settling, but deep down, I knew something was off. I decided to investigate, my heart racing with anticipation. I slowly got up from the couch and made my way to the kitchen, my senses on high alert. As I entered the kitchen, I was met with an unsettling sight. The lights were on, and the room was spotless, but there was a feeling of unease in the air. Suddenly, I heard a faint whispering in my ear. It was a soft, raspy voice, and it seemed to be coming from all around me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The voice grew louder, more urgent, and I could make out the words, "Get out while you still can." I knew then that I had to act fast. I quickly grabbed my phone and dashed to the front door. But as I reached for the handle, I realized it was locked. I was trapped. The whispering grew louder and more menacing, and I knew I had to think fast. I ran back to the living room and grabbed a nearby vase, ready to defend myself if necessary. As I stood there frozen with fear, I heard the sound of footsteps coming from the hallway. They were heavy and deliberate, and they seemed to be getting closer. I raised the vase, ready to strike, but as the figure entered the room, I realized it was not what I expected. It was a woman, tall and gaunt, with long silver hair and eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. She was dressed in a long white gown, and she moved with a slow, deliberate pace. As she approached me, I could feel a chill run down my spine. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't respond, but instead she reached out a bony hand and touched my face. I felt a surge of electricity run through my body, and suddenly, I was flooded with visions of the past. I saw a family, happy and laughing, but also a tragedy, a loss that seemed to consume them all. I saw the woman, standing in the same spot, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. As the visions faded, I realized that the woman was a ghost, trapped in our home for decades. And I knew that I had to help her find peace. With a newfound sense of courage, I reached out and took her hand. Together, we walked through the house, uncovering secrets and memories that had been hidden for years. As we reached the front door, I knew it was time to let her go. I opened the door and she vanished into the night, her eyes finally at peace. As I stood there, feeling a sense of relief wash over me, I knew that I would never forget this night. I had faced my fears and helped a lost soul find peace, and I knew that I would always be grateful for that. This happened to me last summer when I was back at my parents' house during the holidays. I had just finished college and was looking forward to a relaxing break. My parents' house is in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by tall trees that cast long shadows at night. It's a cozy place, but it can feel a bit creepy when you're alone at night. It was around 3 a.m., and I was in my room, scrolling through my phone. I was wide awake, despite the late hour. Suddenly, my phone rang, and I saw my sister's name on the screen. That was already a bit weird since her room was just down the hallway from mine, and she could have just come in and talked to me. But I picked up the phone anyway, and as soon as I said hello, the call ended. I thought maybe she had hung up by mistake, so I got out of bed and walked down the hallway to her room. As soon as I reached her door, I heard her screaming. It was a loud, terrified scream, and it sent chills down my spine. I quickly opened the door and rushed inside. She was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with fear and her face pale. I asked her what was wrong, and she pointed to the corner of the room, her hand shaking. I looked over, but there was no one there. She started crying and told me that she had woken up and seen a dark shadow just centimeters from her face. She said it was tall and menacing, and it had made her feel like she was being suffocated. I tried to calm her down, telling her it was just a dream, but she insisted that it was real. She said she had called me for help, but when I reminded her that her phone was downstairs in her purse, she looked confused. That's when things started to get weird. I checked my phone, and there was a log of the call from her number, but when we checked her phone, there was no record of the call. It was as if the call had never happened. We were both confused and a bit spooked, so we decided to go downstairs and As we sat in the kitchen, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. The house was quiet, but I kept hearing creaks and groans like someone was moving around upstairs. I tried to tell myself it was just the old house settling, but deep down, I knew it was something more. We stayed up for a few more hours, trying to make sense of what had happened. But the more we talked, the more confused we became. It was as if we were trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Eventually, we went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the dark shadow my sister had seen, and the mysterious call that had disappeared from her phone. I started to feel like we were being watched, like something was lurking in the shadows, waiting for its moment to strike. The next day, we told our parents what had happened, but they just shrugged it off, saying it was probably just a prank caller or a bad dream. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew what my sister had experienced. It was real, and it was terrifying. After that night, I started to notice strange things around the house. Doors would slam shut on their own, and I would hear footsteps in the hallway at night. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or my imagination, but deep down, I knew it was something more. I started to feel like I was living in a horror movie, and I didn't know how to escape. I was trapped in a never-ending nightmare, and I didn't know how to wake up. One night, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and started searching the house from top to bottom. I looked in every room, every closet, and every corner, but I couldn't find anything out of the ordinary. But as I was about to give up, I heard a faint whisper in my ear. It was a soft, raspy voice, and it seemed to be coming from all around me. "Get out while you still can," it said. I spun around, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, and it sent chills down my spine. I knew then that I had to get out of the house, and fast. I ran back to my room, grabbed my bag, and started packing. My sister saw me and asked what I was doing, and I told her we had to get out of there. She looked scared, but she didn't argue. We quickly packed our bags and left the house, not looking back. We never went back to that house again, and we never spoke about what happened that summer. But I know that I'll never forget the terror I felt and the feeling. I used to work at City Hall a few years ago as a security guard. It was a quiet job with little to no excitement, but that all changed one fateful night. As part of my duties, I had to patrol the entire building, including the abandoned jail cells in the basement. They hadn't been used in years, but it was still my responsibility to check them regularly for any squatters or trespassers. It was probably my second time patrolling alone when things started to get weird. I made my way down to the old prison holding cells, my flashlight in hand. The hallway was long and narrow, about 6 meters wide and 100 meters long, with cells on both sides. The only light came from bulbs hanging from the ceiling, casting flickering shadows on the walls. As I walked past the fourth column of cells, the lights suddenly went out. I was plunged into darkness, and my heart started racing. I turned on my flashlight and walked back towards the light switch, my beam dancing across the walls. Right when I was about to flip the switch, the lights flickered back on. I thought to myself, this is strange. I'm getting out of here. But I knew I had to finish my patrol. I started walking faster, quickly checking each cell as I passed. But when I was about halfway down the hallway, the lights went out again. This time I heard 2 cells slam shut, the sound echoing through the hallway. I didn't hesitate. I ran as fast as I could, my flashlight beam bouncing off the walls as I sprinted toward the other end of the hallway. I reached the stairs and took them 2 at a time, my heart pounding in my chest. I burst through the door at the top of the stairs and slammed it shut behind me, leaning against it to catch my breath. I was in the main lobby of City Hall, and it was bustling with people. But I didn't care. I just wanted to get as far away from those cells as possible. I made my way to my workstation, my hands shaking as I tried to calm down. I called my supervisor and asked if any electrical issues had been reported. He said no, and I knew I had to tell him what happened. But when I tried to explain, the words caught in my throat. I was stuck at my workstation for the next 2 hours, my mind racing with thoughts of what could have caused the strange occurrences. I was paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting something to jump out at me. And when my shift finally ended, I got out of there as fast as I could. I never went back to those cells again. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was down there waiting for me. And I knew I'd never forget the terror I felt that night, running from the darkness and the slamming cells. From that day on, I made sure to avoid the basement at all costs. I took the long way around, even if it meant being late for my rounds. And when I finally left City Hall for good, I knew I'd never miss that place. But sometimes in the dead of night, I still hear the sound of those cells slamming shut. And I know that whatever was down there, it's still waiting for me. I used to work the night shift at a rehab facility where the streets were rough and the patients were rougher. But it was a job that needed doing, and I was proud to be a part of it. The facility was an old building with creaky floors and flickering lights. It was like something out of a horror movie, but I tried to ignore it. My job was to keep an eye on the patients and make sure they didn't get into any trouble. But trouble always seemed to find us. The patients would get restless and start causing a ruckus, and I'd have to calm them down. It was a tough job, but I was good at it. One night I was sitting at the desk watching the monitors when I saw him. A guy standing outside the gate staring up at the camera. He was a big guy with a scruffy beard and a menacing look in his eye. I didn't like the look of him, but I tried to ignore him. He was probably just some local punk trying to cause trouble, but he didn't leave. He just kept staring up at the camera like he was trying to see something. I tried to ignore him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He was too still, too quiet. It was like he was waiting for something or someone. I decided to use the intercom to see if he was okay. "Hey buddy, you need some help?" I said, trying to sound friendly, but he didn't respond. He just kept staring up at the camera like he was in a trance. I was starting to get creeped out. I called my coworker Mike over to take a look. "What do you think, Mike? This guy's been standing there for 20 minutes, just staring up at the camera." Mike looked at the monitor and his expression turned serious. "I don't like it," he said. "Let's go check it out." We walked out to the gate and the guy was still there staring up at the camera. We approached him and he didn't even flinch. It was like he was in a coma or something. "Hey buddy, you need some help?" Mike said, trying to shake him out of it. But the guy didn't respond. He just kept staring up at the camera like he was trying to see something that wasn't there. We tried to move him, but he wouldn't budge. It was like he was rooted to the spot. We decided to leave him alone, hoping he'd snap out of it eventually. But he didn't. He just kept staring up at the camera for hours. It was like he was waiting for something or someone. And I had a feeling that when it arrived, we were all in trouble. Finally, after 2 hours, he vanished, just disappeared into thin air. We searched the area, but there was no sign of him. It was like he never existed, but I knew he did, and I knew he'd be back. I could feel it. The rest of the night was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was like the guy had left a shadow behind, a presence that lingered in the air. And then just as I was leaving my shift, I saw him again, standing outside the gate, staring up at the camera. I knew then that I was in trouble. I knew that he was coming for me. I ran inside, locked the door behind me, and called the police. But when they arrived, he was gone. Again. I never saw him again, but I knew he was still out there, watching me, waiting for me. And I knew that next time he wouldn't just stare. He'd come for me, and he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. I quit my job that day and couldn't take the feeling of being watched anymore. But I know that I'll never forget that guy, standing outside the gate, staring up at the camera. He was a reminder that sometimes the things that go bump in the night are real, and they're coming for us. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. I was in the office late at night working on an important project. The clock on my computer screen showed 2:04 a.m. Everyone else had gone home, leaving me alone in the big office building. The lights hummed and flickered above me, casting strange shadows on the walls. I tried to focus on my work, but my mind kept drifting to the rumors about the building. Some said it was haunted, built on top of an old Indian burial ground. I didn't believe it, but the darkness and silence of the night made me wonder. As I typed on my keyboard, I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my imagination, but the feeling stayed, and I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. I looked around the office, but there was nobody there. The cubicles were empty, and all the chairs were pushed in. I was alone, trying to focus on my work again. I couldn't shake off the rumors. I thought about scary movies, where someone is always the last one in the office. I remembered the creepy sounds and strange things that happened at night. And then I heard it, a faint creaking sound, like the floor was shifting. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but the sound grew louder. It sounded like footsteps echoing through the empty office. I felt a sense of unease creeping over me. I wanted to leave, but I had to finish my work. So I stayed, trying to ignore the fear building inside me. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, leaving me in darkness. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to move, but my legs felt heavy and unsteady. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to see or hear anything except the sound of my breathing. And then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing in the doorway of my cubicle. It was tall and menacing, with glowing eyes that pierced through the darkness. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I could only watch as the figure moved closer, its eyes fixed on me. I closed my eyes, hoping it was just a trick of the darkness. But when I opened them again, the figure was still there, looming over me like a specter from the beyond. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as it reached out towards me. But just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into thin air. The lights flickered back on, and the office was quiet once again. I sat there, trembling with fear, wondering if what I had seen was real or just a figment of my imagination. I knew then that the rumors were true. The building was haunted, and I had just encountered the malevolent spirit that dwelled within its walls. With trembling hands, I packed up my things and left the office, vowing never to return. As I walked out into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced back at the darkened windows of the office building, half expecting to see the shadowy figure staring back at me. But there was nothing there, just the empty silence of the night. I never told anyone about what happened that night, fearing they would think I was crazy. But deep down, I knew the truth. The office was haunted, and I had come face to face with its terrifying inhabitant. As I walked away, I couldn't help but wonder if it would ever come back to haunt me again. In 2013, my dad and I hunted in George Washington National Forest near Deerfield. It was a cold, rainy trip, and we struggled to keep our primers dry. The woods were understandably barren, and after about 3 days, we concluded that we were the only humans on the entire east side of Little North Mountain. We hadn't seen a single truck, let alone another hunter. That night, I was jolted awake by a howling scream like nothing I'd heard before, echoing down the mountain from just above camp. It sounded almost human, but not quite. I had my eyes wide open and glued to the ceiling of my tent as my mind raced through all the animals it couldn't possibly be when a second call answered the first. This one closer to the tent, probably less than 300 yards down the washed-out trail that wound its way up the mountain just behind our camp. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to my dad, who was stretched out on his cot just across the tent. "Yep," was his one-word answer. "The rifles are in the truck," I whispered back. That was the last time those rifles ever spent the night in the cab of the Tacoma, even during a dank, damp black powder season. The following morning, we were up well before sunrise, joking about Bigfoot and scarfing down breakfast oatmeal before heading out to hunt. Two forest rangers, not game wardens, forest rangers in uniform pulled up and parked right next to our campsite. Without uttering a word, they slung rifles over their shoulders and headed up the washed-out trail in the direction of the yells we heard the night before. No idea what they were after, but we figured maybe they needed to tell two raucous young Sasquatch to keep it down because there were humans in the area. After that, we decided to hunt lower down the mountain. We trudged through the underbrush, our boots squelching in the mud. The forest was thick with mist, and now and then a branch would snap, making us jump. My dad kept glancing over his shoulder, and I could tell he was just as spooked as I was. But we pressed on, determined to bag ourselves a deer before the end of the season. As the day wore on, the mist grew thicker, and the woods seemed to close in around us. It felt like we were being watched, like there were eyes in the shadows following our every move. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. We stopped for lunch at a small clearing, the silence of the forest pressing in on us. My dad built a small fire, and we heated some canned soup, eating in silence as the mist curled around us like ghostly fingers. Suddenly, a twig snapped behind us, and we both whipped around, our hearts pounding in our chests. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. My dad nodded, his hand straying to the hunting knife at his belt. We sat there, frozen in place, listening for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the steady drip of water from the trees above. "Maybe it was just a deer," my dad said finally, but I could tell he didn't believe it any more than I did. We finished our lunch in silence, the unease hanging heavy in the air. As we packed up our gear and headed back into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something lurking just beyond the edge of the trees. We hadn't been walking long when we heard it again, that eerie, howling scream echoing through the forest. My dad stopped dead in his tracks, his hand tightening around the barrel of his rifle. "What is that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. My dad didn't answer, his eyes scanning the trees as if searching for some unseen threat. I felt a chill run down my spine, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Whatever was out there, it wasn't anything we'd ever encountered before. We kept moving, the howling growing louder with each step we took. It felt like we were walking straight into the jaws of some unseen predator, the tension thick in the air. I wanted to turn back, to run as far away from whatever was out there as I could, but I knew we had to keep going, had to find out what was making that terrible sound. Suddenly, we burst into a clearing, and there, standing in the center of it, was a creature straight out of a nightmare. It stood at least 7 feet tall, its fur matted and unkempt, its eyes glowing in the darkness. It let out another bone-chilling howl, and my dad raised his rifle, his hands shaking. But before he could aim, the creature vanished into the trees, leaving us standing there alone in the clearing, our hearts pounding in our chests. "What was that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. My dad shook his head, his face pale in the dim light of the forest. "I don't know," he said finally, "but whatever it is, I don't think it's from around here." We stood there for a moment longer, listening to the sounds of the forest around us, the howling growing fainter with each passing moment. And then, without a word, we turned and headed back to camp. The memory of that terrible creature burned into our minds forever. We never did find out what it was that stalked us through the woods that day, but one thing was for certain: we would never forget the terror of that encounter, the feeling of being hunted by something beyond our wildest nightmares. As we packed up our gear and headed back to civilization, I couldn't help but wonder what other horrors lurked in the depths of the George Washington National Forest, waiting to be discovered by unsuspecting hunters like us. I was hunting last summer. The woods near my hometown in Oregon were my sanctuary. Every weekend, I'd trek out with my rifle, seeking the peace only nature could offer. But one summer day, everything changed. I set out early in the morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. The forest was alive with chirping birds and rustling leaves. It would be a perfect day for hunting, or so I thought. As I trudged deeper into the woods, I noticed something odd. The usual sounds of nature had gone silent. No chirping birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie stillness that sent shivers down my spine. Ignoring the feeling of unease, I pressed on. But the further I went, the thicker the fog became. Soon I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me. Panic started to creep in, but I shook it off. I was an experienced hunter after all. I could handle a little fog. Then out of the mist I saw it, a cabin. It loomed before me, ancient and decrepit, like something out of a horror movie. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached cautiously. I knocked on the door, hoping for some sign of life. But there was no answer. With a shaky hand, I pushed the door open and peered inside. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with dust. It looked like no one had been there in years. But then, my eyes fell on something that made my blood run cold. A hunting rifle, identical to mine, leaning against the wall. Fear gnawed at my insides as I backed away from the cabin. What was going on? Who did that rifle belong to? And where were they now? I stumbled through the fog, my mind racing with questions, but no matter which way I turned, I couldn't seem to find my way out of the woods. It was like the forest itself was playing tricks on me, leading me in circles. Hours passed, and still I wandered through the fog. Exhaustion weighed heavy on my limbs, and despair threatened to consume me. Just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I saw a figure ahead. A man, standing in the clearing. Relief flooded through me as I stumbled towards him. "Please," I begged, "help me. I'm lost." But as I drew closer, I realized something was wrong. The man's face was twisted in a grotesque grin, his eyes empty and soulless. Before I could react, he lunged at me, his hands clawing at my throat. I fought back with all the strength I had, but he was relentless. It was like fighting a demon straight from hell. Just when I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, I heard a voice calling my name. Through the haze of pain and fear, I saw a figure emerge from the fog, a woman with a rifle slung over her shoulder. With a swift motion, she raised the rifle and fired, the shot ringing out like a thunderclap. The man's grip loosened, and he stumbled back, a look of shock on his face. Then, with a final scream, he vanished into the mist, leaving behind nothing but a trail of blood. The woman helped me to my feet, her eyes filled with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked. I nodded, still reeling from the encounter. "Thank you," I whispered, "for saving my life." She smiled gently, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "You're not the first hunter to stumble into these woods," she said, "and unless we do something about it, you won't be the last." Together, we made our way out of the woods, the fog gradually thinning until we were bathed in the warm light of the setting sun. But even as we left the forest behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark and sinister still lurked within its depths. And as long as that cabin stood, no one would ever be safe in those woods again. In September, I embarked on a solo hunting trip in the vast wilderness of Wyoming, seeking to bag an antelope. The landscape was breathtaking, with rolling hills and endless sagebrush stretching as far as the eye could see. I had been preparing for this trip for months, and finally I was here, surrounded by nature's splendor. As I trekked through the terrain, my senses were on high alert, scanning for any sign of my prey. The sun beat down on me, casting a golden glow over the landscape. I had been walking for hours, and my canteen was almost empty, but I pressed on, driven by my determination to succeed. Suddenly, I spotted my quarry in the distance, a beautiful antelope, its coat glistening in the sunlight. I raised my rifle, took aim, and fired. The animal dropped, and I felt a rush of excitement and pride. I had done it. As I walked towards my prize, I noticed something peculiar in the distance. A light, incredibly bright and fast-moving, was hurtling towards me. At first, I thought it was a game warden on a side-by-side, coming to check my paperwork. But as the light drew closer, I realized it was unlike anything I had ever seen before. The light dove into the sagebrush, disappearing from view. I was perplexed, wondering what it could be. I looked around, but there was nothing in sight. No vehicles, no people, just the endless expanse of wilderness. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized I was completely alone, with no phone signal to call for help. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, focusing on the task at hand. I tagged the antelope and began field dressing it, my hands moving with a practiced ease. But my mind kept wandering back to the mysterious light. What was it? Where had it come from? And where had it gone? As I finished my task, I looked up and my heart skipped a beat. The light was back, traveling away from me at an incredible speed. It was unlike any vehicle I had ever seen, moving with a fluid grace that defied explanation. I watched in awe, my mind racing with questions. But as the light vanished into the distance, I was left with a sense of unease. I felt like I was being watched, and the silence of the wilderness seemed oppressive. I quickly gathered my gear and began the trek back to my truck, my senses on high alert for any sign of danger. As I walked, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I could feel eyes upon me, boring into my skin. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The silence was oppressive, and I knew I had to get out of there as fast as I could. I finally reached my truck, my heart racing with fear. I tossed my gear into the back and jumped into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. As I started the engine, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I was safe. But as I drove away from the wilderness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something behind. Something that was still out there, watching and waiting. The memory of that mysterious light haunted me, and I knew I would never forget the terror I felt in those lonely hills. From that day on, I avoided hunting alone, always making sure to have a buddy by my side. And when I looked up at the night sky, I couldn't help but wonder if that light was still out there, hurtling through the darkness, searching for its next victim.